Hello everyone, this is Lam here. In today's video, I want to do part 2 of the X-H1 versus the X-T3. When I did the first video, I actually did not have the X-T3. I was speculating on a lot of the specs that were rumored to be. Fast forward till now, I've had 2 weeks with the system. I've shot at 2 events, and I've also been out a few times shooting for myself so I can actually share those on YouTube. And I've actually learned quite a lot. And I still think there's actually room for the X-H1, but it is kind of a niche market at this point. But I still do like this camera. I do plan on keeping this camera, but to be honest with you, I'm more really planning on keeping this system for the YouTube channel and keeping up with the firmware updates and also seeing where the X-H2 is going and being able to compare it with the X-H1. For most people, I would say yes, I would point you to the X-T3 because it's such a well-rounded camera. But there are some instances where the X-H1 will shine, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. If you're watching this video right now, you most likely have watched other videos comparing the technical specs of both these cameras, and you will know that this camera is going to be much more advanced. This is essentially a 2-year-old sensor wrapped around some image stabilization technology, which is great, but it's still a 2-year-old sensor, and there's really nothing we can do about that. But what I will say about this is that when you're actually using these cameras out in the real world, you will not see a big difference in performance. In other words, when I'm shooting photos for both these cameras, it's not like I'm seeing a drastic improvement on how efficient I'm shooting my photography. It's actually very minimal. A lot of people are going to be touting how advanced the focusing system is on the X-T3, and they are right. It is a great system. The full sensor phase detect is excellent. You can use the entire range. It definitely helps out in video. But on the flip side of the coin, with the firmware update to the X-H1, I really don't have any issues with the focusing system on the X-H1. So in terms of using the focusing system in the real world, I don't really notice much of a difference. Now, I've only been using this for 2 weeks and I've been using this for a couple of months. Maybe I've gotten used to the focusing system and its quirks and it just doesn't bother me, but I don't feel like this system over here is out of date. So that's what I'm really trying to say. Yes, on paper, this is actually a better focusing system, but in the real world, when you actually shoot with it, you really don't notice much of a difference. Now, let's talk about the sensor. Obviously, this is a newer sensor. It's backside illuminated. It's going to be a sharper sensor as opposed to the X-H1, but I'm not much of a pixel peeper. So for me, once again, when I look at the photos and when I see them, I don't notice much of a difference. Fujifilm does a great job of updating the firmware on these older cameras, and they keep up really well with newer cameras. So I don't really feel like, the extra megapixels is going to be drastically improving your photos. Yes, the sensor over here is better, but you also have to remember that at higher ISOs, it's actually not performing as good as the older sensor. And that's because of the phase detect system in here. It's actually going to perform slightly, very slightly less better at higher ISOs. But at the base ISO, it's going to perform better in lower light situations. So it's a give or take. What I'm trying to say basically is that you're going to be able to do great with both sensors. It's just really up to you and your composition and how you take photographs. That's going to determine how good your end product is going to be. Going to the last point I want to cover, which is video. And oddly enough, this is supposed to be the video camera and this is supposed to be the photo camera. I will say there is a big difference at that point. So if video is important to you, this is where it's going to be really hard to make the choices. At the end of the day, the X-T3 is just significantly better at video. With the full sensor phase detect, better slow motion, better 4K, it's just outright better video camera. The only upside to this one over here is that it's image stabilized, which means if you're hand holding a lot for your video, this is still going to be a superior video camera, because when you're hand holding, if you return back with shaky images, no matter how good the quality of the video is, it's still going to be unusable video. So this is going to be drastically better if you can't hold your camera steady on your X-T3. So there is some hope for this. But honestly, if video is your thing, I would always point you to the X-T3. And when you actually need stabilized video, you either go into slow motion or you're just going to have to buy a gimbal. And gimbals nowadays, they're actually relatively cheap compared to what they were a couple of years ago. So I still think this video camera overall would be better. Now, having said all that, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Because I basically said, for the most part, everything is a wash except for video, in which case I would lean you towards the X-T3. unless you're getting back a whole bunch of shaky video. Here's the thing about the X-H1. Because it looks like a DSLR and because the battery grip actually forms really well to it, it's a very good looking machine. If you're going to be doing a lot of professional work, I would point you towards the X-H1. And the reason why I say this, and even though it sounds a little bit vain, it is really true. And it's that when you're out there doing professional shoots, the gear that you use has to look professional. I know this sounds really bad, but having done photos and videos for years at professional events, the gear that you use and how you present yourself is super important to the people that you're around. And this just looks more professional, period. I would always opt to bring this body with me at a professional event in which I'm delivering a product at the end of the day, regardless on whether or not if this is the better camera to bring with me. This is just the fact that I personally believe in. If you don't believe in that, by all means, bring the X-T3. But for any event that I'm not shooting for myself, I would always opt for the X-H1. This will be the first camera that I bring out with me, and I would bring the X-T3 as a backup, and then maybe another camera for a time lapse. I actually enjoy doing time lapses. It's a great bonus to give to anybody who you're shooting an event for. Now, if I'm actually shooting for myself, I would always opt for the X-T3 because it's such a great small compact camera and it's such a capable system. But this is when I'm shooting for myself, like I just did on that bourbon trip. It was a lot of fun to use the X-T3. It was nice and very light, and it had such amazing video capabilities. It's really fun to work with. There are a couple of other factors that you might want to consider before purchasing either of these cameras. Number one is the ergonomics. If you're going to be using these cameras for long periods of time, the X-H1 is just going to be more comfortable just because of the nice large grip. It's just going to feel better in hand. Of course, you can work around this, but what I find is that if I'm working with a very large glass like the 50 to 140 or the 100 to 400, this camera body is going to be significantly better to use because of the ergonomics, and you're just going to enjoy using it a little bit more. And at the end of the day, that might actually improve your photography, because if you're going to be uncomfortable for long periods of the day, your photography is just going to suffer, or your video is going to suffer. So take that into consideration. The last thing that I want to mention, and this is very minor, but it could be important to you, is that the X-H1 is actually a very capable silent machine. It's actually pretty remarkable how quiet this machine is. Let me go ahead and turn this on, and I'll just take a picture with the shutter. So I'm gonna bring it next to my mic, and so that's what it sounds like over on the X-T3. So let me go ahead and put it on continuous high. So this is 11 frames per second, I think. So that was 11 frames per second, and on this side it's also going to be 11 frames per second. So as you can tell, there is a big difference in sound, and in most events, if it's going to be very noisy, it probably will not matter. But if you're going to be at an event that's going to be very quiet, the X-H1 is a great machine for that, especially if you want to use the shutter. I don't mind using the electronic shutter, but if I can use the mechanical shutter, I will. But at the end of the day, this is still relatively a quiet shutter, and I don't think you're going to bother a lot of people using the mechanical shutter on this. But I did want to show you a differentiation, because when you're using both these camera systems, you do notice a difference when you start taking pictures with the mechanical shutter. It's noticeable every single time I swap in between cameras. At the end of the day, if I actually had to choose one camera that I would buy over the other, I would still choose the X-T3. I think overall it's just a better machine. It's so capable. I just love using it so much because it's such a compact camera. But keep in mind that of the two cameras, this is probably the less professional looking camera, and I'm not really doing much professional work. A lot of the content that I'm trying to create is for YouTube, so I prefer the smaller cameras at this point. If you're doing a lot of professional work, this might not be the recommendation for you. Just keep that in mind. But the X-T3 at $1,500, you really can't beat it. It is the best blend of photography and video at this point, and I love using this camera. All of the auto settings at this point is kind of world class. I just can't believe how much they fit into this camera for $1,500. If you own this camera, I think you know what I'm talking about, and I would always recommend this camera. The X-H1 at this point is more of a niche product for me. If you're using big glass, if you need better ergonomics, or if you just want to look more professional, this is definitely the camera system for you. Anyways, those are my quick thoughts of it after using it for a couple of weeks. I'm sure there's going to be more as I use the X-T3, but really I think you should be happy with both cameras and just enjoy using it and forget about all of the technical jargon. As long as you're enjoying what you're doing, that's really all that matters.